Cool. Yeah, me too.
From your profile. Here we go. I'm going to live. Done. Let's see how many people we have here so far. Hey, everybody. This is going to be a very, very, very fun conversation. Before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor, which is Sheath Underwear. And I do wear these every day. And the thing about Sheath, Will Chamberlain, yeah, you make the face. That's what happened. So this is what happened. I'll tell you the story, Sheath Underwear. They brought him into the studio, and I'm like, what is this? This looks insane. Because Sheath has a double pouch for your guy parts. And then I tried
double pouch.
One for each part of your guy parts. And I tried them on, and I'm like, these are the best boxer briefs I've ever worn. So if you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice20, one for the elephant and one for the grapes.
That sounds more like some sort of medieval torture device than it does, or a chastity belt than it does underwear. But I'll take your word for it, Mike.
You don't have to take my word for it. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off. And they've got camo prints to make your genitalia even more invisible, which is my situation. Hung like a thimble. Let me introduce you to everyone here. Will Chamberlain is the guy who is the head of human events. I had him on Gas Digital a while back before this censorship was kind of ramping up. I thought it'd be good to revisit the conversation. Let me make one thing clear for all the cretins in the audience. Many times people come at me on Twitter and be like, you should debate this person, you should debate that person. And what I always say is, I don't debate people. I did it once with Tom Woods, very failed podcaster, and I was a very failed debater. He kicked my ass. Unfortunately, the word debate has several different meanings, just like the word friend. If you have a friend at the office, and the friend is someone you call when your mom dies. These are very different concepts. So we're not having a formal debate. These are two people who like each other, respect each other, going to listen to each other, and have different points of view and exchange them. So it's a debate in that context, but it's not. So don't get on my ass about why you don't debate X, Y, and Z. That's not my thing. We're pals, right?
Of course. Oh, I mean,
okay.
I did college debate. I know what formal debate actually looks like. We'd have a judge somewhere judging it, and we'd each get 8 minutes to talk on our own, and I'd be speaking at a speed you probably wouldn't be able to comprehend and would sound in a very high-pitched voice. It'd be very bizarre.
What underwear company was your sponsor?
I'm sadly not sponsored by any underwear companies. This is clearly a problem that needs to be remedied.
Sponsor. This is not a debate. If you're not talking about genitalia, it's not really a debate. It's not a debate.
I wish I had used that tactic when I was in college. I probably would have won nationals instead of quarterfinals or something.
So
like that.
Your position, has it changed at all since you were on my show? And if not, we're talking about Section 230. Your point was Twitter's the town square. I don't care. We have to mandate having it the town square. Why don't you lay out what your response is to what's been going on the last 2 weeks?
So yeah, I mean, my position, I think I articulated actually for the first time publicly on your show, which is the idea that it's a civil right, that we should conceptualize the idea of being able to use Facebook and Twitter and speak on those platforms as a kind of civil right. Like, free speech is a constitutional right, but insofar as it's a constitutional right, you're only protected against government censorship. You're not protected against private censorship. I conceptualize a civil right as something that we say is sufficiently important that we insist that not only the government respect your right to speak, but private entities do as well. And obviously that's, there's limits on that. You can't just, otherwise that completely obliterates free association. But my view is that you don't have meaningful free speech in 2020 unless you can speak on major social media platforms. They have effective monopolies over their area of interest, and they act collectively when they don't. And basically, like, 230 is sort of a secondary issue from my perspective. I think, I want to see reform to 230, but it's 230 was a statute designed to solve a different problem, right? Okay. 230 was designed to solve this problem of, can you moderate at all if you're running Facebook and Twitter? Because, there were some court decisions that came out that basically said, well, if you don't moderate, you're not liable because you didn't speak. But if you do any moderation at all, then effectively you've exercised enough editorial judgment to be liable for any defamatory posts. And so Congress, in their wisdom, was like, okay, that's stupid. So we're going to let you moderate and without getting exposed to defamation liability. This is, this is a different question entirely. We're talking about censorship, right? And the 230 questions, they all are sort of indirect. Like the idea of reforming 230 is like, okay, if someone's a victim of censorship and you say, well, we're reformed to 230 to fix that, and it's like, well, what about that? Doesn't help me at all. That means that some other asshole who's defamed can sue Twitter now, but that doesn't help me. I am the victim of censorship. It's my rights that have been infringed. We should write a statute to redress those rights. And I think, so my view is, obviously we're not in power right now, but the next time the conservative movement is in power and in control of the federal government, thing number one on the list is essentially a civil rights type law at the federal level that prohibits this sort of discrimination and radically constrains the extent to which Facebook and Twitter can ban you or censor lawful speech. Okay,
so this is where I completely disagree with you, because I think you would agree with me that people we're up against are operating in bad faith.
Yes.
And that to expect them to operate in good faith is neither of us are pretending that that's the situation.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you are looking at this from the function of you're an attorney. So the attorney's, natural response is this has to be solved legally. Here's what I'm hearing what you were saying. You had just said earlier, well, obviously there are going to be some limits. What I'm hearing is, if we look at people who are being censored and vanished from the internet, Laura Loomer, Alex Jones, Gavin, Milo, all these other people, when you look at any article that's written about them, it'll say something like Laura Loomer, comma, who has been described as a blah, blah, blah by the SPLC, comma. So the author of that article or the person behind Facebook or the person behind Twitter is outsourcing their discriminatory policy. They are pretending they have clean hands. Agencies like the SPLC, I'm sure you agree, are not operating in good faith. There's not even an appearance of magnanimity. They do not go for like Hamas-like agencies. They only go for one side of the aisle. And when you have what you're saying, well, obviously some things have to be limited. What I would do as Jack is be like, well, I have no choice but to ban these people because the law says I have to ban extremists. Don't blame me. Yell at Congress. And in my view, let me just finish my thought. It's a lot easier to effect change on Twitter than to effect change on Congress, at the very least by creating market alternatives.
So I guess two points on that. One is that when I talk about like there are limits to the idea of civil rights legislation, I don't mean in terms of well, you don't necessarily have to. You could easily make a rule that says essentially the First Amendment governs, right? Whatever is First Amendment.
You're saying easily, but I don't think any of these laws are easily implemented. When you have
like
negotiators,
right? Well, I mean, because I actually think this one's simpler than a lot of people realize, right? I think, and one of the things we talked about in our prior debate is like, what's the enforcement mechanism? Do you have a regulator or do you have litigation? I think litigation is the obvious enforcement mechanism.
Okay.
And that's why I also like the First Amendment law as this sort of like, you just kind of port it to this different area. And you're basically saying, okay, Facebook and Twitter, you're like a public university campus or a public park in how you can regulate.
And that you should be destroyed by tanks?
I'm sorry.
You said if it's like a public university or public park, you're saying we should come in with tanks and raise it.
Well, okay, we can get rid of, obviously the seize the endowments question is a distinct at this point.
Yes.
But no, I think maybe we just seize, what public parks used to be after the tanks run through after the tanks run through Harvard Yard. We remember what free speech rights were like at Harvard. That's a private university. What they were like at Berkeley, and then we implement it the same way. And then also, you put the courts in a position where they're evaluating First Amendment cases. They do that all day long and actually works pretty well in terms of protecting free speech rights for individuals who want to speak. Richard Spencer, they tried to stop Richard Spencer from speaking at Florida, and that failed. Like every other attempt to censor, somebody trying to show up on a public university campus has failed. It's just really robust. There are a lot of conservative judges now who interpret the law as written, and that's, I think, a real benefit. So, if we're not saying like, oh, we need to have ex ante regulation, but no, just say to, if you go to, you give people a right of action to sue Facebook and Twitter to restore their accounts if their First Amendment, lawful speech is censored, or if they're banned for First Amendment lawful speech.
But now I'm concerned about when you're talking about smaller sites that are dedicated to more niche audiences. Now they're also going to have to lose the ability to kick out, for lack of a better word, trolls, and to have it be this kind of velvet rope world, which I'm very much in favor of. I think freedom of association is far more important than freedom of speech.
Well, I think I would make 2 points. One, you can obviously tailor the statute to impact only the big social media companies, which is how I would tailor it. I want to preserve the right for niche communities to exist. And but really, I think
you're saying this word obvious, and it's not obvious. Can you explain?
User, this civil rights statute, this right of action for American citizens to go to court, only applies for platforms with more than 100 million users.
Okay.
Right. Like, or, and if it needs to be 400 million or 300 million.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? So that's the, that solves, that's one way to write the statute that solves that problem in a pretty, this didn't take a think tank to figure that one out. Right.
Sure.
And so you avoid that problem. And then the question is, okay, well, I think, freedom of association is important, but we've also, there's freedom of association has given way to other rights in this country for 100 years. And I think that, and it's given way against conservative principles and values many of those times. And I think the idea that we should be completely unwilling, when our adversaries are using, one of the things we talked about, I remember our prior debate, we talked a lot about how I was coming at this from sort of like first principles that were more left wing because, I was using civil rights and that's a left wing principle. Like the left is using right wing principles against us right now. They are using, it's a private company, it's a free market. They would never use that argument in any other context for any other regulation, but they love it when it comes to social media censorship. And the idea is like, if they're willing to suddenly think that it's just peachy that a billionaire has this much power over the public square, and when they want to regulate billionaires in every other context, everywhere else, it should be an indicator that maybe there's some real politics going on here, and we should be on the other side of that debate.
But we've already seen that loophole being opened or shot through because we are in the process right now of having anyone who went to a MAGA rally be classified as domestic terrorists. And there's no question, I'm sure, in your mind that any of these statutes would have to have exceptions for things like promoting violence.
I'm not clear. Remember, if I'm saying the First Amendment, incitement under the First Amendment is actually pretty narrow, right? It means direct incitement to like immediate lawless action. And so that would sort of, there's a lot of, you think, clearly, the executive branch and Biden's White House is going to try and define these things really broadly. It's like, well, what happens when they show up in a court and try and say that, this sort of speech should be shut down? If they tried to do that, you'd expect the courts to be like, have you read the last 100 years of First Amendment case law? That will not work. We have already established that this sort of loose, using things like incitement to violence loosely does not fly in our courts. That's Brandenburg, that's a million other cases. And I think that's why I like, as a combined solution, right? You use litigation, right? You create a private right of action the same way that there's private rights of action under the normal civil rights statutes. You say this person can walk into federal court, say they've censored me for First Amendment protected speech. And now there's this law that says, that this is First Amendment protected speech. We have a million precedents that explain why it is. Therefore, Facebook and Twitter can't ban you. Therefore, they got to give you back your account. And that's actually literally what Poland is doing. Poland is literally following what I know that they actually follow my Twitter feed, oddly enough, because I talked to a few of their legislators. But they're following this. They plan to implement basically this law that says Polish citizens have a right to not have their speech censored by Facebook and Twitter. And if Facebook and Twitter do that, they have to either restore the account or pay a $2 million fine. Oh,
okay. So right now, I'm sure you heard what happened with Parler, which is, they tried to ban them off the internet. And basically now it lasted, less than a week. This is something I'm sure you weren't particularly happy about, what they're trying to do with Parler and how this was a sustained across the market attack. And then very quickly, they had to reroute all the traffic through Russia. And I think they're resumed operations. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I haven't seen them up yet. I haven't seen anybody posting about it. So.
Okay. So or that's where they're heading, at least. Do you not agree with me, and I think you probably do, that having market alternatives is a much more secure mechanism to guarantee some sort of freedom of discussion for the simple reason that there will always be disingenuous attempts to censor thoughts that is threatening to the establishment.
I mean, if you're saying, would it be better if we had like a completely private internet stack that was available to compete with the existing, like, because like it's clear, like, okay, it's not enough to make your own social media company. You have to make your own web server now. You have to make your own hosting service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to make your own. I'm sorry, Google and Apple have 99.8% of the mobile operating system market in this country, and they acted the same way collectively to shut down Parler. Sure. So I think, you know, if you were assume that all that entire tech stack exists, then yes, that would be better. But in my view, that's a 20-year project, and I'm not sure that any individual one of those companies is even investable at the moment by any sort of like reasonable VC, because of the odds that there will be this collective action by the part of the tech alliance to shut them out and then thus make them like pariahs. So I mean, you know, I was talking with Charlie Kirk about this, and one of the things he was thinking about was like, well, you need a state to just subsidize the creation of this entire alternative tech stack, because like there's just no, I mean, how on earth, what rational venture capitalist would invest in an alternative tech stack at the moment?
Well, we don't need rational ones. We need people like John McAfee.
Right. Well, I mean, okay, but John, the problem is he doesn't pay his taxes. He gets thrown in jail. Right. And like, you know, there's this article,
go ahead.
or there's a million other ways that like the combined efforts of government to leverage pressure on you in every other different way. I mean, so another good example, we actually published an article kind of more along the lines of your view, which is by Charlie, because we disagree on this point, that he's like, Elon must save us, right? And he's like, Elon Musk build this like giant tech stack to save us or something. And I'm like, that won't work. Turns out Elon's like super dependent on China for Tesla's continued wealth. He's got serious problems with the SEC. So like and the NHTSA because his cars aren't safe. So there's all these different avenues of pressure that can be placed on him by the government, by the powers that be. He can't even possibly be like the adversarial venture capitalist to the establishment. He has to be working with them. And like, you know, all this stuff is just it's a 20-year project in my view. It's extraordinarily complicated. Sure. And there's a much more, we have, you know, this was not the solution. Like, I don't want to bring up civil rights in the sense of like, oh God, it's the same. I mean, whenever I bring up civil rights and Jim Crow, people are like, oh, you're saying it's the same as Jim Crow? No, I'm not. But the point being like that's not, when you're facing mass collective private discrimination, mass collective coordinated private discrimination, the answer is ultimately going to be, a much better answer is going to be federal law, abolishing it. Because that worked in the 60s. It worked.
I think a better answer is to have what people regard social media as being problematic about, which I think is solution, is this increased what people call siloization of Americans, which is at some point to recognize that we are not going to be having these conversations, that these conversations are not fruitful, that there's an entire population of people who want you dead and will settle for your submission, although decreasingly that's the case. And to try to, I'm also very concerned about codifying places like Twitter and Facebook into law as basically being the town square, for the simple reasons that then they're in a position to lobby for all sorts of advantages and be like, look, we're the town square. It's like if
like Section 230. I mean, like they already have a massive liability shield.
Hold on, you know? No, it's like if back in the day, CBS, ABC, and NBC, which were the three channels, if they had some sort of protection, and they're like, look, it's not and they could say with a straight face to all the Congress people, it's not fair that we have all these burdens. We have to create these regulatory hurdles for these other upstart companies to be able to compete with us because we represent the American people and they don't.
I mean, if like, you know, we've been talking, the alternative, I guess, is like you're sort of still kind of pinning your hopes on some future competitor showing up. And I feel like
we have
the events of
competitor.
What Parler,
Gab, Instagram, all these other things.
Parler's already they're dead. If you don't have mobile S, you're dead as a social media network. Like you're irrelevant. No, like 90% of social media consumption is on mobile. If you're not on mobile, you're irrelevant. It's not. I think they're already dead. Like I don't
understand how you can consider Twitter to be the town square if they're in a position to kick Congress people and the president off.
I mean, it turns out that when, you know, not only 20% of the American public, but also like every other major influencer, like politician, artist, you know, think tank policy journalist, like everyone's there that is like functionally where all the public square is for all these like public debates. Facebook doesn't function that way because the nature of the Facebook system is that it's really segregated. Like there's not like debates constantly happening between random people. That's Twitter. And I mean, yes, like if you have some massive media platform, like I think Trump probably will be okay, but I think he's already hurting. Honestly, like how much influence has he had on public discussion in the last week? Like he's quiet. He could. I mean, think about what would be happening if Trump was on Twitter right now while the National Guard stuff was going on. I mean, he would be lighting it up, but he's not. It's almost like he's irrelevant. And you don't have to control 100% of the discussion to have the town square. You control, if you control the hub for 30% of it, and then everything else is sort of distributed, decentralized, and thus not followable, not observable, then you have the town square. And like, I mean, again, there's just so many ways in which it's obvious. I mean, think about the massive diminution of influence that has happened to people who've lost their Twitter accounts. Milo, Alex, go down the list. Trump now. Think about how hard it is to be a journalist without a Twitter account.
Well, hold on. But I don't think that's necessarily a function of Twitter. I think and I think you'd agree, it's a function of things that are broader, which is if it was simply Twitter, they would be, if not fine, maybe limited. But the fact that Twitter is working in tandem overnight with all these different agencies, that is what's causing this effect. If someone just lost their YouTube, they'd still be very efficacious.
I mean, it depends on where their platform is. I mean, it's harder to build a platform in other places. But like Twitter, for particular things, like Twitter is the center of it. I mean, because I see YouTube as ultimately kind of downstream of Twitter, right? Usually, I figured that out a while back when I watched YouTube videos and realized they were all looking at Twitter for their ideas.
I'm not. This isn't a gotcha. I genuinely don't know how many people are. Do you know how many users YouTube has versus Twitter? I would imagine
more.
YouTube's
Substantially more.
Yeah, okay.
So it's like, I mean, but ultimately, it's like the way I see it is, it's like, where does the debate happen? And while this debate is happening here, generally the debate happens on Twitter. Generally, that's where like everything starts. And I think it's important to have. I mean, and I think proving they have a complete monopoly isn't necessary to say like this is an incredible power that Twitter has to control and influence public discourse by shutting people out and deplatforming people. It's a power that's really incompatible with a serious cultural commitment to free speech, right? And that as a result, they should be subject to regulation, right? Like you don't need perfect monopoly to ultimately, I mean, think about like common carriers, right? There's not only one common carrier in a lot of these markets, but for example, you might have 2 cable companies or 2 phone companies or something. But ultimately, like that's, the powers that be will say, well, guess what? Like we're still imposing common carrier regulations. You can't just deny service, like, et cetera. That's kind of my view here. I think getting bogged down in, is this actually a perfect monopoly or is this a completely uncompetitive market is like beside the point in a sense. It's like how this is dramatically harmful to meaningful freedom of speech in 2020 or 2021 now. Conservatives don't have to sit here and watch, or like if we had power, we wouldn't have to sit here and just watch people get banned and how our conservative influencers' voices diminished. We could say, guess what? We're tired of this. No more discriminating against conservatives. You guys, your Twitter and Facebook, we're gonna treat you like your public university campuses and how you regulate your speech. That's just it.
When someone says that's just it, that's not just it, because we have very many different agencies who are going to do everything in their power to subvert and work around this and so on and so forth. So I find, but no, you're just saying that's just it. Like Case Claysby can go home, but that's not how I see it playing out at all.
I mean, okay, so it doesn't work out perfectly, and then what happens? Like Twitter and Facebook, like don't. I mean, to me, that's just it's ultimately like mitigating. It's not actually defeating the thrust of the point here, right? Like we're facing this immense censorship, and it's literally they just took the sitting president of the United States out of his most powerful platform, and they just did it, and it happened, and he couldn't do a thing about it, and they wiped out a ton of accounts. I mean, it's been hemorrhaging.
Yes,
tons and tons of people getting banned, losing 1 million+ follower accounts, 500,000 follower accounts. Doesn't matter. And the consequence to them is what? Like a blip in their share price. They don't care. They don't need us, right? Like, if anything, conservatives are just sort of annoying to Twitter. In a world where like they could get away with banning us all, I think they might.
I don't think they're conservatives just annoying to Twitter at all. I think the people who are running it are in constant existential distress that their baby, their house, is being used by people who they regard as evil to further their agenda. And I don't think that they know how to wrap their heads around it. By all accounts, and maybe I'm wrong, you feel free to correct me, I think Jack Dorsey has to hear a daily drumbeat from his employees about how are you letting this happen? You're basically letting the Klan run free.
So this is, again, why this is actually a core reason I think it's a good idea to pass a piece of civil rights legislation, because it solves this problem for Jack Dorsey, and I'll explain why. So let's go back to Jim Crow. You're a restaurant owner or a motel owner off some highway in Alabama.
Okay.
Are you killing it financially in the 1960s Jim Crow South? Are you just making money hand over fist? No, you're not. Right? You're scratching by. Okay. So
I'm sure there were some that were doing great.
I mean, it's a poor, the Jim Crow, remember, the South has been, was a lot poorer, especially in the 60s. So you're not killing it. Okay. So if suddenly you're realizing man, there's all these black customers who need a place to stay. Why don't I let them stay?
Sure. Right.
Right.
It's mandated racism.
Right. But the thing is, it's not just the law, right? It was also the private collective pressure of white consumers. There was a level of disgust among white consumers,
absolutely,
just pure racist disgust. That meant that the choice for them was if we admit any black customers, we lose all our white customers. So even if we were profit maximizers, we just have to go along with Jim Crow. That problem went away after civil rights, because so say you got your racist customer who comes in and he's like, I don't want to sleep in a bed that a black man slept in. And then the hotel owner could be like, well, too bad, racist, because the federal law says we can't discriminate. So suck it up or go sleep in your car.
Right? Wait a minute, that's not what happened at all.
That is I'm pretty sure that's ultimately what happened.
I know this is anecdotal, but I had a friend who's Italian, and she went to the South, and it was a Wendy's or McDonald's, and she ordered her fries, and they told her it's going to be a while, and you're going to have to wait for those fries. So there's plenty of.
I'm sure there's some committed racists.
Yes, of course.
Who will resist in the same way that there might be committed social media companies.
Of course,
who resist. But ultimately, the point when you get back to Jack Dorsey having to deal with the constant whining of his employees, we just give Jack Dorsey the complete relief. He's suddenly he's now a phone company, right? If a bunch of employees at AT&T or Verizon were man, all these white supremacists are calling each other. We need to shut down their phone lines. But that's
happening with Visa and MasterCard. You know this as well as I do.
It shouldn't. More non-discrimination legislation, right? Just take them out of this game entirely, right? I am for creating a world in which these basic common carriers, unless they have evidence of unlawful use of their platforms, unlawful, right? Not distasteful, unlawful. They got to let people use them, right? You don't, and that way you get these people out of the debate entirely of, our platform's being used for things we don't agree with, and blah. Jack Dorsey doesn't have to worry about it. Any employees who are telling him, you need to censor this guy, he can just tell them to go away. Because if he did what those employees wanted, he'd be facing $2 million judgment in court or something. That's the world we need.
I have never heard of or seen, doesn't mean it can't happen, any such edict from government where immediately the market, especially giant corporations with lobbyists, didn't have actionable workarounds.
I mean, there's always a chase between whatever law you write and the way to loophole it. But again, this is the beauty of using things like the First Amendment as essentially your rule book for what governs. You're I'm going to find a loophole in the First Amendment to be able to ban something that I don't want to. It's that's really hard.
No, it's not. It's really easy. Being un-American is obscene.
Is obscene? That doesn't work. Obscenity has a narrow definition. There's a pile of case law that you'd have to go into court and fight over.
Not for me.
Not for for you. Are you a federal judge?
You're telling me there's no federal judges who are going to do this?
That are going to win on appeal, that are going to work. No, really. First Amendment. People mistake First Amendment case law is really, really robust. They aren't just going to magically invent new doctrine, especially with a Republican Supreme Court.
The First Amendment has historically been much weaker than people realize. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, it was illegal even for a doctor to discuss contraception with their patients because that was regarded as legally obscene. It was illegal in the mail to discuss contraception and reproduction because that was regarded as pornography. There's something kind of ironic, which I'm sure you've seen, that a lot of these videos for guns, like how to manufacture, like how to put a bump stop, not the handle. I'm such a New Yorker. It was just very innocuous gun culture videos. YouTube just said this isn't us, and they ended up on Pornhub. And I tweeted out, we're all going to be laughing when Pornhub's where you have to go to watch Daily Wire videos. The point is there are enough, and they're putting into place now all sorts of things after the so-called insurrection to make sure that you can't have these discussions. It's going to be very easy to just say, this kind of talk is un-American, it's sedition, seditious language is not covered by the First Amendment.
I mean, I don't know how to tell you, but like, if there was some meaningful way to bet on this prediction, I would happily take my side of it. I think.
Well, obviously, you take your own side.
Right. But no, but like, there's just, I think you are simply underestimating how robust and well-developed First Amendment law is in terms of its protections for freedom of speech, in terms of how, people want to lawyer the way and be like, oh, obscenity, oh, incitement, I can lawyer my way around these. It's like, no, you're not. These are doctrines that have been well developed and they've been defined pretty narrowly because the court's been very expansive about how it's interpreted speech. Thank you to the ACLU for all their lovely work in the past, not anymore, but in the past. And
yes,
so they represented the Nazis in Skokie. They even tried to represent one of the Charlottesville people for a little bit before they got shot down by some of the progressives there now. But like, the point being, it is really robust. It's not as easy to like, and every time, I mean, it's not that the private companies are the only people trying to get away with censoring people. Like, state governments try and do this stuff all the time. Cities try and do this stuff all the time. Public universities try and do this stuff all the time. They just get slapped down constantly. Like, if you look at the arc of First Amendment law in this country and how it's developed, it's gotten to a place where it is very, very protective of the individual's right to be free of government censorship. And I think if you just say, okay, now that body of law that is so robust, that is so enforceable, that works so well, that now applies to Facebook and Twitter too. It's not. It is. That's why I want to use it, because it makes it easier to avoid this whole loophole, clever lawyering problem.
I just feel that and I'm not a lawyer, as obviously, that when you have it's the same people who are writing the laws as implementing them, and you have Congress in conjunction with these tech media giants, Congress will very easily have definitions that will mandate the result that they want, especially, as you've seen, Ben Shapiro, who is hardly a libertarian, right away was realizing what they're trying to do right now is to make it illegal to have even the Daily Wire discuss the internet.
Right. And I mean, but all this stuff that they're thinking about and planning, I don't think it's not going to work out for them. Right. If they try and use the government to censor, the First Amendment is going to smash them the same way, and the Supreme Court and the appellate courts are going to smash them the same way they smashed public university campuses that tried to silence Richard Spencer.
By that logic, I should be able to have a gun.
Second Amendment actually is a lot more novel in terms of how recently developed. I mean, this is a difference in the comparable history of like how recent. Heller is the case that finally said officially, and might be a tweak in the law, that there's an individual right to bear arms, right? That's the first case. That was like 2005, I think, or 2004, something in that neighborhood. And the Supreme Court's had like one other case where they've actually interpreted it, because there's been a whole slew. The appellate courts don't even know what to do with that. Like, how far does this individual right go? 2008, right? So This is all super recent. First Amendment law and like the protections of it, it's a lot, in terms of the move towards aggressive protection of the First Amendment. We're talking about the 1950s and 1960s when that started, and that's had, 60 years, 70 years now of case law, whereas this one has like 10 and maybe 1-2 Supreme Court cases total on the subject. So I think if you're saying like, why can't you have a gun? It's like, well, I mean, if I would expect Second Amendment case law over the next 20 years to develop the way we want it to, if, the support isn't packed. But I think it's a lot. It's like, I mean, I guess there's that whole, I forget, the Man of All Seasons had this whole thing about the law being thick with weeds, and just law, like the First Amendment law is very thick and robust, and Second Amendment law is thin.
Yeah, there's cases to draw on, as opposed to this hasn't been litigated until recently.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the other question I have for you. I completely lost my. This is something else you're going to see that is going to happen. The Republican Congress and a Republican president passes what you like. Mm-hmm. At some point, it's inevitable. There's going to be a Democratic Congress. Mm-hmm. Chuck Schumer or whoever follows him is going to get in the Senate court and say, look, the Republican white supremacists have made it a law that people who are planning to sedition, the insurrectionists, to overthrow the government, we can't even shut them down for Twitter. And the crazy far-right Supreme Court has upheld them. We have no choice as patriots, as people who believe in the Constitution, as people who want to keep Americans safe, but to add to the Supreme Court, because those justices were put there illegitimately by a president who wanted to overthrow America.
I mean, that's always a risk, but that's a risk no matter what, like whatever law we put in place.
It's not whatever law, because that speech is, that would be night as night follows day.
I mean, I think he would try, they might try. It's in the history of non-discrimination laws and common carrier laws has been that they've been continuously protected. It's rare for them to be constrained or
but if I'm back in the Supreme Court, Chuck Schumer is going to sit down with who's the Attorney General in New York, whatever her name is. He's going to sit down with her, and she's going to know exactly what to do.
Oh well, I mean, I'm going to assume that if they manage to successfully pack the Supreme Court and do all this, then we're all lost anyway. Like, okay. I mean, every debate about free speech is irrelevant, but it's also like we've also lost the idea that an alternative tech stack is going to be the solution in a world of a packed Supreme Court that can make laws essentially banning those people and proscribing everybody involved.
I don't agree with that, because here's a counterexample to what you're thinking about. Maybe you're not that familiar with this. I'm not saying that in an insulting way. Are you familiar with torrents and Pirate Bay?
Yeah, I remember them. Yeah.
Well, for those who don't know, there used to be one site called Napster, right? And Napster was a site where basically you can go and buy MP3s. Because when I was a kid, maybe Will was in diapers back then, I am a dinosaur. The record companies had this very clever technique. You would have a single on the radio and you love that song and you just want to get that song. And they'd be like, too bad, you got to pay $18 for the whole CD. You can't buy just that one single you like. And these albums be full of filler crap. And as a kid, when you don't have money, that $18 meant a lot, And
I used Napster when I was a kid.
Yeah, no, hold on. I'm just explaining to the audience because they might not know this ancient history to them. And then, I've got all blurry. Oh, they're on to me. Oh, crap, big tech. I'm the ghost of Lars Ulrich. And what happened is Metallica, so Napster was a company, and I think it was paid. You join Napster, and now you pay for $1 for that song. You can download it. I don't remember if the record companies got a cent of this. Let's pretend they did. If they didn't, doesn't matter. Metallica flipped their crap. Metallica sued. I don't remember what happened as a result of this. I think Napster got shut down or became a subscription service. But the market had to respond, and it responded in two ways. One, you had iTunes, where now the companies are like, okay, we're going to sell you for a song for $1. You don't have to do this crap anymore. So they basically try to co-opt it. At the same time, there were organizations called like the Pirate Bay. And what the Pirate Bay does, if the stream doesn't go out that I mentioned them, it's like when I was talking about Building 7 with Alex Jones. What the Pirate Bay does is any TV show, any movie, any ebook, any record, you can download it for free, because they're like, okay, so you didn't want to take our $1 and you want to make a legal case, how about you get nothing? And the Pirate Bay has now been operating for over 20 years. There's infinite mirrors of it. Every government on earth is trying to shut them down, and they've not been successful. So my point is, I don't know what the Pirate Bay is doing correctly, but that is clearly the model to follow.
Well, I mean, the problem is that it's just that's a very different market from social media, and I mean, there's not a network effect in the same way.
No. Sorry, what I meant, I wasn't being clear. What I meant is, in terms of you're saying if the pack court happens, like we're all lost. Yeah. This is an example of the technology defeating all the different governments. So
right, but like to a degree, I mean, it's like it did it ultimately. I mean, is like the Pirate Bay still around? I think.
Yes,
or did it defeat?
I
mean, it forced a change in tactics among the companies, but I think like you get to a point where they just made it harder. There's a combined effort where they just make the government makes it hard, right? Like, and they make it really obnoxious, and they put all sorts of legal traps for people and arrest a bunch of people. And suddenly, I mean, to me, like the analogy would be like, you remember online poker and the crackdown there? Like
Sure.
that worked really well, if I remember correctly. A lot of companies would bust. It crushed the online poker wave at the time. I remember I stopped playing. To me, that's a lot more of like an effective analogy, because online poker benefited from that network effect too. Like the more players you had, the more money there was to be made, the more popular it was and fun it was. Once it was this incredibly hard thing to do, it stopped being nearly as fun, because only the very, very highly motivated people would play, and those people were really good. And then suddenly, it was just, the market collapsed.
Well, right. That's a little bit different, because if I'm just downloading torrents, there's no degrees of it's not special. It's not competitive.
But it's one thing if you're downloading torrents. It's another thing if you're trying to like communicate, influence public discussion. Like this, you don't really care if you're doing it with anybody else. Like if you're the only customer of the Pirate Bay, whatever, right? Like as long as there's the content there, you're fine. Whereas if you're the only guy talking to yourself on Twitter, like, or on your private social media platform, or if you're talking with like 100, 500 other people, well, a lot of the juice goes out of it. I mean, this is why Parler and Gab, like what happens is Twitter engages in some censorship. A bunch of people, this was how it worked in the past at least. Twitter engages in some censorship. People are like, Twitter's terrible. I moved to Parler, and 2 days later, everybody's back on Twitter, because that Twitter has the juice that Parler doesn't, because it's the public square, like it's the hub. And I think, and so, yeah, getting back to the original point, I mean, if that's the case, why not implement a federal law? And I think, I guess one point I want to make, and it's sort of kind of to take like a 30,000 foot view, like, I think that, Michael, your objections are mitigation. They're not like, in debate, we would distinguish between defensive and offensive arguments, right? A defensive argument is like, your plan won't work. It won't get it. There are some problems. It could fail. And an offensive argument is actually your plan will cause these destructive consequences, and we shouldn't do it because it will harm people, right? And I would characterize almost every objection you're making to my plan, if you will, as sort of a mitigation defensive type argument. And it's like, well, then, I mean, as long as, I have like a reasonable chance of accomplishing what I'm trying to do, even if there's like some regulatory difficulties and some implementation difficulties, et cetera, like, why not go with it? Because as opposed to not.
Because I think anytime you have corporations working with legislators, they will always write the laws in order to favor themselves, and they will always create loopholes that will force them to get the result that they want. I think it's very difficult. And now this is something where I think you'd agree. We're going to be on the same page here. It's going to be very difficult to find a majority in either house of principled Republicans or Democrats who see things in the way that you and I do, and write it in such a way that's actually interested in having full debate. I don't think they believe in these principles on any level, for the vast majority of them.
I think, that's true, but like, to me, that's very similar to the position that civil rights advocates found themselves in the 1950s or the 1940s, right? Like, and ultimately they managed to change people's minds in 10 years. And they were facing, you read the stories of like, I don't know if you've read Lyndon Johnson's,
God, no.
Oh yeah, you should not. You don't have to read his work. You should read the biographies of him by Robert
Caro. Lyndon Johnson is. I think he's so uninteresting. I hate everything about him.
Really? I think he's a fascinating character.
No, he's disgusting.
No, he's not a good guy. He's a terrible guy.
He's a good guy. I don't find him interesting.
Really?
Not at all. No.
Have you even tried to read those Caro books?
It's like, why would I want to read a book about someone who's as of no interest to me?
Because it's like the most interesting exposition of power I've ever read. I think I found those books. To me, it's like they're the books you have to read about politics to understand like a whole bunch of stuff. They're just extraordinarily educational about the workings of power, how power is gained, how it's wielded. I get it,
but it's very hard for me because those books are very detailed. He's not done with the last one. I think he's got one to go.
No, he's still working on it. Yeah.
Yeah. About someone who, and he doesn't present him anything else, as someone who is so thoroughgoingly disgusting of a human being. And I'm the guy who went to North Korea and wrote the book on Kim Jong-il. And Kim Jong-il, at least to me, there's something humorous about him. Johnson, to me, is just it's so gross. It's like Ana Navarro doing porn. It's like, I don't want this, even if it's some kind of scientific interest.
Right. Well, here's the thing, right? Like I think the big JFK is much more popularly well regarded. He didn't do shit.
Yeah,
like what did he do? He didn't do anything.
He stopped.
He died.
He stopped anti-Catholic prejudice, so that's kind of a big deal.
Right, but like
ceiling.
in terms of like passing laws that changed like our country, like zero, right? Like under Lyndon Johnson's presidency, a set of laws were passed that radically changed our country.
Great Society, yes, correct.
Right, like Great Society, Civil Rights Act. I mean, you go down the list; it's a huge amount. Like it's actually, in a lot of ways, you could argue it structured our modern welfare state, like the entire legal, big chunk of legal regulatory apparatus we operate under. Okay, how did he do that? And why did he, this asshole who's just like obnoxious and crass and disgusting and like the worst guy ever, how did he do it? Why couldn't JFK do it? The like polished, charming guy, right? Like that's
because of Goldwater.
Because of Goldwater.
It's true.
I mean, you're sort of adopting the Goldwater position.
No, I'm just saying Goldwater blew it so badly, he got these huge majorities.
Well, it's just, I think, the Goldwater is found himself in the position that ultimately kind of the sort of pro-tech libertarians are going to find themselves on this debate. Like their position just isn't popular. Like I've noticed, I have a lot of debates with these tech policy types, and I'm not talking about you, obviously, like,
of course, yeah.
But like the libertarian tech policy types, and they're just like, this will not work. Platform access is not a civil right. I'm like, yeah, except people are starting to think it is now. Yeah, right. That's like.
Yeah, defining terms in good faith is not going to win any debate.
Right. Thank you for describing the law to me. I'm a lawyer. Like I'm aware of what the current law is. That is not an argument against changing the law.
Okay, let's take some questions from the fans. Matt says, I hate the idea that if I invent something that didn't previously exist, my business could be nationalized, even partially if my product gets too popular. It doesn't sound like you're talking nationalization at all.
No, I mean, I think the simple, I think every business operates under these civil rights laws. I mean, I use nationalization as an example of like hyperbole when it's like, would conservative speech be freer if Facebook and Twitter were nationalized? I think the answer to that question is yes. But that's sort of an attempt to dramatically show like what the impact it would be of having the First Amendment apply to these companies. And so that's kind of why I use it. But I'm not, I don't advocate nationalization. Although, like, if that's the only thing that's going to protect free speech and the civil rights option is off the table, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not that invested in Jack Dorsey's, freedom of association rights. I'm just not.
Let me ask you this question, and I know I'm pretty sure I know your answer, but what if this kind of thing makes people driven away from Twitter? Maybe conservatives disproportionately act in bad faith, or maybe they're disproportionately obnoxious. And it's important for me as Jack Dorsey to create a company that curates a good user experience. And part of that is having these un-American seditious views be banished from my platform.
And that's like Jack Dorsey's view about like what he wants for his company.
Yeah, like, I mean, what is wrong with that perspective from your perspective?
Well, from my view, it's like he's running essentially a free speech platform, in my view, or what should be a free speech platform. And I think that basically I don't want AT&T in the business of shutting down people's phones, right, for a wrong thing. I think basically I want Jack Dorsey to be in the same situation as AT&T or Verizon, and any other phone company where they're a common carrier. They're not responsible for what people say on their platform, right? Like, and that's sort of implicitly like the 230
thing,
right?
Yeah.
Like they're not responsible.
This actually makes a lot of sense to me, this point where they're trying to have it both ways,
right?
Because they're pretending they legally don't have responsibility, but they're acting as if they are responsible, and they're having the protections without the responsibilities of erring on the side of free speech, and that's disingenuous.
Right, and I'm perfectly happy to say like these companies' business models don't work if they are responsible for third-party content. I'm like, that's fine, but that means that like you benefit from this liability protection under current law. Why aren't we saying, okay, and that means you guys don't get to do political censorship, right? Yeah. Like you don't, right? You say like you don't want to be associated with speech. Law already says you're not associated with this speech. That's 230, right? 230 already says this is not your problem, so don't treat it like your problem. Right. And, like focus on unlawful speech and we're fine, or like actually unlawful speech and we're fine. But like you guys you're playing games with this power we've given you. And I think, I don't think that doesn't mean that that power should be taken away, because I think the consequence of that is worse. That means I think we need this, corresponding regulation to essentially make you behave.
Do you think censorship comes from people or from algorithms? I'm not sure I follow that
people.
question.
I mean, who writes the algorithms? Like that's where people write the algorithms. So either they make individualized determinations or they do so. And I mean, I think one thing you mentioned earlier, I forgot to mention this, like the problem is like under current law, we basically have Twitter is both like the legislator, the executive, and the judicial branches all in one. There is no separation of powers. There is no due process. There's no right of appeal. There's no third party arbiter. Like there's none of that. And I think with something as important to people as a Twitter or Facebook account, I mean, people invest thousands, tons of hours, tons of labor. If you want a libertarian friendly argument, how about labor mixing, right? Like
that's the most unlibertarian friendly argument. That's Marxism, the labor theory of value.
No, it's not the labor theory of value. It's the idea that like the idea of like how Locke says that property comes to be. It's like people mix their labor with property and it makes it theirs.
Yeah, he was a pre-communist.
You're not a fan of Locke. Okay, well then I won't try this argument.
Yeah, I mean this idea that just because I do a lot of work, therefore I have some property in something is it's. I remember this on and I saw this on Judge Judy, so therefore I'm basically Amy Coney Barrett. But the guy was renting a house. And he did home improvements and wanted like money for it. And he goes, well, when I rent the house, it's mine for that period. And she's like, no, it's not. Like, what the hell are you talking about? So just because I'm adding, value to something that isn't mine to begin with doesn't mean I have a property right in that thing.
Well, it's a question of equity, right? Like, and our law actually recognizes this in a few areas. I don't know if you're familiar with adverse possession.
No, go. What do you mean? Like, go ahead. No,
well, adverse possession is like it's a doctrine in property law. One else learn it all the time and have trouble with it on the law school exams. The idea is that if say you got a squatter on your property, and he keeps building up stuff and working on it, and you don't kick him off, like you don't do anything about it for like 10 years. It's like, and then you like 10 years later, you're like, okay, get off, you're trespassing. The court will be like, nope. He actually like as a result of you sitting on your rights, he has like a right in what he's done, and that can be as simple as like, oh, he actually gets the whole property now because he's used it and you've never enforced it, or it could be something like an easement where it's like, okay, they have a right to drive to get onto their property because they've used that for forever. You've never stopped them. It's a part of doing it. And I mean, to me, there's an element of that. Like Twitter went out and marketed itself as a free speech platform to come in, speak, and say your mind, whatever you want.
He said that publicly. We're like the free fringe or the free fringe. Yeah.
So everybody does that, invests immense amounts of time and energy building up their platforms, and then Twitter changes his mind, snaps his fingers, and says, "We're going to take your platform away." Like, is that just? Feels pretty unjust to me. And would that fly in other contexts? Well, not in other
don't care
areas
about
of
your
law.
Feelings. Well, laws don't care.
Laws don't care about your feelings. But part of my point is that it's a persuasive effort to say that the law I propose is ultimately just, right, and good and right.
Do you think free speech is inevitably tolerated only if it doesn't challenge power?
No, I think free speech in this country. In many countries, that's not been true. There is something really valuable and unique and good about our country and the fact that we've managed to create a rule of law and a robust First Amendment, where it's a lot of people are committed to, and there's a real institution, there's a real robustness to it in our country. The speech that questions, Trump won. That was like. There's just, and Richard Spencer can speak on any public university campus in this country if he wants to. There's real power there. That's not true in other countries. Hasn't been true in most times and places, but it's uniquely true about our country. And I think that that's something we should preserve and embrace. So
what I'm hearing is that this law should be the Richard Spencer Act. Okay, got it. We all heard him say it.
That's terrible.
I think it's as simple as any power you give the state that will only use against the innocent. The enemy just controls the state. Why defend you, lawyer man?
Because this doesn't give the state any additional power, right? Like the state already has the power to like impose some sort of like regulations and civil rights laws. The law I propose says it doesn't create a new agency, doesn't give any regulatory power to a new executive branch agency. It says this is a litigation law. It creates what's called a private right of action, which is a right of Americans to show up in court and say it's now actually a tort if Facebook and Twitter take off my content, my lawful content, right? Like there's no state actor that gains power as a result of a law, like except the courts themselves. But like, again, the courts themselves are constrained by their sort of inherent tradition of trying to follow the law and by the fear of reversal by appellate courts in the Supreme Court ultimately. So like, if you're talking about which body of the state I would be more happy giving some additional power to, it would be the courts in that in the context of the First Amendment. And I think, saying that the enemy controls the state, it's like, well, the enemy controls the executive branch, so don't give the executive branch more power. But does the enemy control the judicial branch?
Yes.
I'd say it's a substantially closer question.
Fair. This judicial branch doesn't send people to murder and doesn't murder you. So yeah, it's a lot. That's yeah. Well, no, it does with the prisons. So I guess it's a wash.
I mean, it's the weakest branch of government. That's Hamilton from the beginning, and that's proven to be true, I think.
The answer to this question is yes. Hold on. Let's see who else we have here. Telecom companies are effectively legal oligopolies due to subsidies, regulatory capture. Do you think this is a great question. You think popular platforms should be regulated like telecoms?
I mean, I guess broadly speaking, yes. I think obviously, like, I don't. Telecoms, there's a little bit more of like a consumer welfare angle that I'm not quite as concerned about in the social media world. I am kind of pretty focused on this like speech right. I want to create essentially a free speech right for social media. I don't think you would need to do that for Verizon right now based on existing law. But I mean, I also, if somebody explained to me how taking telecom regulation and importing it over to social media would accomplish the same end, I'd be open to listening to it. It's just not my angle.
What does your gut tell you? Do you think we're going to start seeing people kicked off of their cell phone service providers because of their political views?
No, I don't think they'll get there. I mean, Uber and it's enough. Basically, they're able to unperson people already with the current list of things they can do, right? Like, the combination of credit cards, PayPal, the financial stuff, social media, and like Uber, Lyft. I mean, that's what's been done to Laura Loomer is enough to scare anybody.
Do you think this is the kind of thing where you should also have Uber and Lyft couldn't unperson someone because of their political views?
Yes. I think that they absolutely take them out of the business of that. Yeah.
Okay. And Visa and MasterCard, of course.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Let's see what else we have here from the here we go from Giannis. This is shithole money. Is it cheaper to incentivize ignorance or research? Is there a reason deflation because centralized? What language is this? What country is this? CHF. Where's this person from?
Swiss francs.
He's from Switzerland? Oh God, why do we have the Swiss? Is it going to make us full of holes? Your argument is full of holes. I don't understand what he's saying.
I don't understand. I don't know. I don't understand what this argument is.
Does the U.S. deserve its 2030s?
I don't even know what that means.
No, he means that 230, I think he means.
Oh, 230? Do our companies deserve 230? I don't know that deserve isn't the right question. It's not that they deserve it. It's that, taking away 230, I think ultimately, it cripples a whole slew of companies, big companies that have been built on it. And just, it snaps their fingers and makes their business models unworkable. So I don't know how Facebook continues to do what it does. Its entire business is facilitating the publication of third-party content. And then if they're liable for every piece of third-party content, it's impossible to vet all the defamation complaints, right? There's so many different ways to lie about people. Like, how are you going to screen that with an algorithm? I don't even know.
Here's a great question from a terrible country. If platforms have to be First Amendment, do they have to allow porn? Because this would be a easy loophole from mandated online ID. And as you know, I'm sure you agree, Will, if you have that mandated online ID, they're definitely tracking everything that you're watching on an individual level. I think there's already some kind of there's plenty of case law on porn. They don't have to, I think, allow porn. You can have, I think, publishers, I don't think they would have to allow porn, right? University campuses don't have to allow porn. But you're saying it's lawful. Porn is lawful by any metric.
That's a good. Actually, I don't know the answer to that question. I think I'm not familiar enough with First Amendment law on porn and because obviously porn isn't given free license. Obscenity is actually one of the categories of speech that can be regulated under existing First Amendment law. So I don't know exactly what that would mean and how it would apply to social media.
Okay, fair answer. This is a great one. If I have a website that allows comments, I want to be able to kick people off. It's my website. So you're saying it's got to be a certain size. At that point, you lose your rights.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like the vast majority of websites, fine. Maybe Facebook and Twitter don't get to do that anymore. Or Facebook and Twitter are uniquely under this constraint of, okay, you are constrained by the extent you can delete comments that are lawful.
This one, I bet you I can guess Will's answer. The only way Will's law gets 60 votes is if conservatives invent a new Facebook and start discriminating against Democrats. Well, seeing something as not being likely to happen isn't an argument for not trying to go for it. I mean, right?
How fast? Like, here's the thing: people have to realize how
Trump's
fast has the debate changed. Trump's never going to get elected. I mean, how fast has the debate changed? Even since we had this debate the first time.
Yeah.
Think about how radically the Overton window on the right has moved on big tech regulation. Like, I was the crazy person saying this stuff 2 years ago, and now I am like my view is like mainstream or pretty close to it.
So mainstream's crazy,
right? I mean, but the point being that if you're saying conservatives will not, I think by 2022, 2024. This will be a part of the platform. Now, whether it gets done, I don't know, but I think it will be a part of the platform.
Here's one from Clayton. If it doesn't give the government any more power, why is it necessary? It socialized the conduct by which an individual can control their own property. I think that's disingenuous.
Well, then it gives I didn't say it gives no part of the government any more power. It gives the courts more power. It's necessary because in the absence of some sovereign power, the power of these private tech monopolies to censor and ruin the lives of conservatives is such that, sovereign power is the only meaningful remedy, as far as I can see it. So, okay. I think ultimately the right of you to speak freely on Facebook and Twitter is more important than Jack Dorsey's freedom of association rights.
I understand. Given the choice between Jack Dorsey and Richard Spencer, you pick Richard every time. We heard you. Will Chamberlain does not endorse those comments and disavows them. I just want to hasten to say, cripple current platforms by removing 230, then let the market venture capitalists decide what then becomes a new public square. Let me handle this. I bet you if I can guess your answer. There is an enormous disincentive in the market. Look how hard it is for Trump to find a lawyer. Look how hard they've made it for Trump's people to find work. So it's not as simple as profit when you have an entire industry dedicated to using things like stigma. The costs become so much extraordinarily higher than the mere potential for profit.
That's one big part of it. And the other one is, okay, if you get rid of 230, you basically make social media impossible, which means we're then back to the media environment of the 2000s, which is mainstream media dominates everything. Like, I like that social media came into existence and created a space to compete. They're now trying to shut it off with censorship. I want to say, no. You created it. You're stuck with it. You're keeping it open to us. That's my view.
Here's one from Shauna. You can get a cheap cell phone through certain state and possibly federal welfare programs, the Obama phone. So there is a mechanism for the left to cancel people's cell phones.
I mean, is there any argument about making the cell phone benefit unavailable to people on the basis of wrongthink? I doubt that. And also, I think if the federal government tried to do something like that, they'd run into First Amendment issues, right? Like, say, the Biden tried to implement a policy that was like, we're going to curtail, or they try to pass a law that's like, we're going to reform this cell phone benefit and say that only right thinkers get the cell phone benefit. Well, then you're an injured person if you're a poor wrong thinker. Go to court, get an injunction, force them to give you the benefit. That's probably how it would work, as I understand First Amendment law.
Free speech doesn't exist, only tribe speech. If you're the dominant tribe, you have the luxury of allowing other tribes to talk freely. Otherwise, free speech is pure liability. Zero. This guy's Zero Lovecraft is a Twitter guy. What do you think? What do you think about that?
I mean, that's a function of current. That's an accurate description of the way the free speech works under current law. But I think you could change the law to make that different.
Okay. And I don't think it's pure liability, but it's certainly the biggest threat is free speech, especially when you're calling people out on their lies and depravity. It's very expensive for them to have free speech in that capacity. Can insurance companies deplatform people's political views? That is, they cannot. Can they? They haven't. I don't know if they can. They haven't done so. I don't
Think about all the I mean, there are all these different mandates. Insurance is actually one of and not just health insurance. Insurance generally is one of the most regulated areas of the law. When people talk about pure freedom of contract, that concept was thrown out the window in insurance hundreds of years ago. There's so many constraints on premiums you can charge, coverage, like, kind of contracts you can offer, what has to be in them, et cetera. So can insurance companies deplatform people? I mean, there's literally a mandate that says they have to or that says they have to cover you even if you have pre-existing conditions from the healthcare.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of constraints on their ability.
That's the one thing they would rationally want to be able to discriminate against. Like, wait a minute, the whole point of insurance is it's like a lottery, and you're coming in with a losing ticket. We don't want you. Sorry, you have to take me. Yeah.
Like, I think that would be. I mean, that would. I think that's almost certainly unlawful under current law. The idea that they would be able to just turn away someone or not, because there's constraints on how much they can't what's the word, gouge you on insurance. Like, there's all sorts of gouging rules about insurance premiums. So, like, especially and there's car insurance mandates. Like, there's no way that the government would allow car insurance mandates to exist without some sort of regulation to prevent gouging.
This is a great question from Clayton. If this is determined by the size of a platform, do you agree with progressive income tax?
Yep, sure. I think a progressive income tax makes sense. I think
so. A progressive income tax and car insurance for people who drive the speed limit, right?
Yeah, man, my radical ass platform, man. I am way edgy.
The only reason our telecommunications aren't centrally controlled is because the public doesn't have access to them. Never thought of that. I don't know if I follow this.
I think he's trying to say that it's like, if the reason that Facebook and Twitter are censored, from my perspective, is that they're not constrained by the First Amendment, or that's why they're engaging in so much censorship. And it's like, yeah, it's really paradoxical. Oddly enough, wouldn't have anticipated it as this is a problem 6 or 7 years ago. But hey, when the facts change, I change my mind. Got to be flexible.
Michael shilling for Sheath is the only thing that's ever given me blank envy. I enjoy. I'll give you another shill right here. This is from that Worry coin that I talked about on Lex. I enjoy promoting products that I use, especially when it's a small business owner. I think that's that everybody wins, and I'm sure Will agrees.
Yes.
You don't?
I stopped paying attention once it was the underwear stuff.
Okay, I'm go it again until you listen, because this is a First Amendment issue, and now you have to listen to me, and you can't block me from your headphones. What I was saying is, I'm very happy to promote a product that I use, especially if it's a small business owner, and that way everybody wins.
Yes, that is good. Very virtuous.
If it's not just about size, aren't we just creating disincentives or creating tools that aren't popular?
I mean, there's the huge benefit of having a monopoly. I mean, I don't think this in and of itself will be sufficient to disincentivize the next wannabe, 100 billionaire.
Oh, right. Here we go. This is an interesting one. AIG canceled insurance for a Trump supporter. Kurt Schilling lost his insurance. Remember this? Because he was at the rally.
Oh,
That's interesting.
Well, maybe that shouldn't be allowed either.
Okay. Let's see what else we have here. Do you think in 20 years they're going to say we have to change the internet because the right was mad? Seems unappealing to them.
Seems unappealing to who?
The left, I'm guessing.
Right. I mean, maybe the left won't find it appealing. Maybe the left will benefit from the law, right? Like, I mean, I can think of a lot of ways in which if you create a law like this, there will be leftists. Think about those Antifa accounts that were censored. They can walk into court tomorrow and say, no, we were lawful. You got to give us our account back. And I think, at a certain point that power, becomes something that both sides use and that ultimately constrains behavior in Facebook and Twitter. And people are like, you know what? We're kind of okay with understanding that Facebook and Twitter just can't ban people anymore. And
there was, I think, did you see this? I think today I saw it, someone texted me. I think it was Glenn Greenwald was reporting that Facebook blocked a bunch of lefty accounts. I think it was some Antifa accounts, some BLM, and some kind of pro-Palestine accounts. Did you see this?
Yeah, I saw some of that. Yeah.
So it's what you were talking about. I think when you have this kind of oligarchical system, it tends to encourage corporate speak, and anything that's marginalized in any way, it makes people uncomfortable. If they had their druthers, the edgiest show on TV would be How I Met Your Mother. Right.
And it's like that censorship is going to happen on both angles. It's going to happen a lot more on the left now that Biden's president, because there's no utility. Biden has no use for Antifa anymore. Right. It served its function. It's not useful anymore. So I would expect there to be a lot more censorship pressure on the left.
Just joining. Sorry if this was asked. Why would nationalizing be better than prohibiting tech from accepting government money via grants and contracts?
Well, I mean, the problem is the subsidy already worked. It's great. I mean, it's put these companies in a massively strong competitive position, and simply saying to them, well, you guys can't take any more money. Like Facebook would be like, fine, we don't need it. We're the most profitable company. Like you talk about like Facebook or something. We're the most profitable company in the country already. And it has nothing to do with government money anymore. And in fact, it's really nice that you can't subsidize our competitors. So that's great too. We're fine with that.
Nick has a great point. He goes, if your metric for who's affected by these laws is popularity, if someone's website becomes very popular due to being great, they're screwed for being a good entrepreneur. Lame.
That's the way our whole country works, man. Like, welcome to, Obamacare had a mandate for big businesses, not small ones, progressive tax rate. Like, you go down the list, like we impose more obligations on the wealthy than we do on the successful than we do on the poor and less successful. And there's a wisdom to that. They're in a position where they can afford it regulatorily. And I think, people like, to me, it's like, of course, Facebook and Twitter should have to deal with more of a burden from our government. They have so much meaningful control over the public square that's what should happen. And the other argument is people often say like, well, what about the baker? Like, would you force the baker to bake the cake? And I'm like, no. And they're like, well, how is that consistent? I'm like, because I think that an individual baker should have a lighter regulatory touch than Facebook.
Okay, like my argument, which I don't think you disagree with, because we're talking about theoretical versus reality, is in reality, it is almost never the case that the law is written to favor Facebook at the expense of the baker. True.
And I mean, so you have to figure out you have to make sure that it gets written the way you want.
But I mean, this is something we both agree on. Like in practice, that is, they're the head of Jack Dorsey will always have every senator at his beck and call, as opposed to whatever activist from right or left. Much easier. We got a celebrity question from the first winner of America's Next Top Model, Adrian Curry.
Oh, really?
Yes, here she is. When stay safe now means investing in a ham radio certification and Faraday bag to dodge Trumpster investigators on your tail. She's gone full prepper. She is going to be, Adrian Curry is going to be the most beautiful mole person that has ever living underground.
So, I mean, I think this is also sort of my problem with, think about when you're saying, okay, we need to build an alternative tech stack to compete with Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Google, Amazon, and all the underlying web infrastructure. Like, if you're already afraid of like having to put your stuff in a Faraday bag, like how can you run a company like that? How is that company investable? It's not.
But I'm surprised you disagree that is in the medium to long term the only final solution. Sorry to use that term, to this issue.
I disagree. I think that politics is less absolutist than people realize. I think you could pass next time Republicans take power, we pass a civil rights law. Everybody sort of realizes how they're benefiting from it. And
I don't think this would benefit the people in power, though. I think this has hurt them a lot, because this is what allowed Trump to become president. And you saw very quickly, I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, both parties have quickly coalesced to be sure, like, we can never let this happen again.
I mean, maybe we'll be screwed because of that. But I'm not gonna like.
No, but let me ask you this. No, I'm not trying to argue. I honestly want to hear your opinion. Do you not agree with the analysis that free speech is an enormous threat to whatever establishment is in power at the time?
Oh yeah, it's a big threat. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is something that I think you and I are probably both trying to square that circle, and maybe you think it's surmountable and I don't think it is. But I think the only way to solve that problem, for me, the answer to the Second Amendment is gun proliferation. Right? Mm-hmm. That is a far more effective mechanism to make sure that gun rights cannot be taken away if everyone has them, as opposed to like tort and Second Amendment legislation. And I'm sure you'd agree to some extent, no?
I agree, right? Like people should go and own guns and buy them, but also like it's not smart to be in a jurisdiction where like you're breaking, like Enrique Tarrio broke the law, brought some high capacity magazines to DC and got arrested for it.
Oh, I'm not arguing that. What I'm saying is it's asymmetric, right? Mm-hmm. If everyone has guns, it's a lot harder to pass a law to take everyone's guns, because the cost of doing that's going to be prohibitive, right?
Right.
So if there are enough technical steps in place, if there were alternatives to Visa and MasterCard, blockchain, whatever the hell they are, at a certain point, if they're like, okay, you can't be on Visa or Match, or like if you and I or someone are banned from ABC, CBS, NBC, that might suck, but it certainly doesn't mean that we're vanished and can't make our voices heard if we're on Fox or some cable channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the long-term answer to this. Okay. Respectively, the ultimate defensive position is, yes, sure, good entrepreneurs are screwed, but America always screws them anyway, so sorry.
So, I mean, but like that's weighed against the offensive benefit of like, hey, every conservative now has their speech rights protected, right? Like, again, the idea is when your arguments are only defensive against a plan, a policy proposal, it's like usually you want something a little more, offensive. Like, why would it make the world worse? So my point is that, the objection to my plan that says, well, entrepreneurs should have the freedom to do whatever they want. I'm like, well, welcome to America. Like, that's not actually that weighty an objection ultimately, especially when compared to the benefit of protecting conservatives from censorship.
I don't know that I feel comfortable protecting people from just feeling the need to tweet Democrats are the real racists in perpetuity for 30 years. I mean, some of these conservatives, it would be just as fine if they vanish.
I'm sympathetic, but that's why should the Nazis be able to march in Skokie, Illinois? And, I'm sure that the ACLU people defending them were like, I really don't care that much personally about their well-being, but, there's a bigger principle at stake.
Here's a great one from James. Tech Freedom Association has instigated a huge trend to innovate. Would the greater good be served by not constraining that process?
No, I mean, trust me, like the constraints that will result on tech as a result, if conservatives are censored, are far greater than the ones that will result if this particular restraint is imposed. Because like the ultimate freedom, you lose conservative freedom of speech. Well, guess what? Guess what the left's going to do to tech, broadly speaking? They're not ultimately that big fans. So I think that's one point. And then two, I think there's freedom to innovate in any number of different avenues of tech. Like tech is not just social media. So the idea that, right, like putting in place this particular regulation on Facebook and Twitter already mess with billionaire companies that limit a particular vector of innovation, right? I'm not interested in further innovation of how to censor better, right? That's what that's the vector of innovation limited by this. And it's only limited for these companies when they get to a certain size.
Good question from Essay. Do you think the Constitution will need to be refreshed sooner or later, and how dangerous could that be? Oh God, I'm not gonna touch this one.
I think we probably disagree. I'm not incredibly dangerous. Civil War is no joke. It's not. People also think like it's not 1865, guys. This is literally in 1865. What happened is like the state militias of Alabama and Mississippi just walked into the federal armories and took them. Right? Like that's not what's going to happen in like our Civil War. The federal government is so much stronger than it was in 1865. That
1861, you mean?
1861, right?
Okay,
beginning, yeah. So much stronger than it was in 1860, 1861. That it's like, comparing overthrowing. It'd be like, the ease of overthrowing, I don't know, the government of Rwanda or something, and probably even easier then.
I disagree, but I think it would be very a bad idea to be discussing the pros and cons of civil war.
Agreed.
But I don't agree. If Twitter is compelled to give a home to the untouchables, won't the woke aristocracy migrate to another smaller platform? Well, that's their problem.
They're addicted to. They're addicted to. They can't leave either. We're all stuck with each other.
If your position is that that's not how America works, then you might as well give in to progressives because they've won every battle for the past century.
Well,
I don't think they have won every battle at all.
They haven't won every battle, but they have won certain battles, right? Like,
sure.
And I think big part of my argument here is like, when people are like, well, they're a private company, they can do what they want. I'm like, we've settled that debate. That's wrong. No, they can't, right? Like, we settled that debate in 1964. We settled that debate like 100 years earlier with common carrier laws. I mean, there's so many areas where like private companies actually can't do whatever they want. They actually do have to obey a whole slew of laws. And the idea that we shouldn't therefore impose one law to protect our ability to speak and influence public conversation. I mean, it just seems like there's like this weird, it comes from this weird libertarian impulse that's like making any new laws is bad. I'm like, no, I just don't agree with you. I think you could write a new law that helps you achieve your ends, even if it's not Pareto optimal, right? Somebody else is constrained by it, whatever, but like on net, it's good for you. So why not?
Yeah, why not? Thad Russell says that when you take into account 3D printer and unregistered boom stocks, there's like, I think you mean boom stocks, right? For the guns?
Yeah, or bump stocks.
Bump stocks, yeah. There's likely 1 billion of them in this country. There's infinite if they have printing ability.
Yeah.
Would such rules be turned back on the right? What happens when the left can come in and drown out non-woke spaces because they can't bend leftists? Let me answer this one, my opinion, then I want to hear yours, Will. I don't think they have the numbers. So I think they punch above their weight because they have dominance in important institutions. But if it comes down to a numbers game, as the election just showed, 2020 was a repudiation of this. It was the Democratic establishment, the corporate Democratic establishment, consolidating, taking Biden's carcass from the coffin and having Amy Klobuchar and Buttigieg endorse him to stop Bernie, who was ahead in every single poll on Super Tuesday other than Minnesota, which was Klobuchar's home state.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it, I think that's true. The left doesn't have the same sort of ability to do that. But secondly, again, my proposal applies only to really big social media companies, right? Like, so it wouldn't be usable as like a weapon against smaller institutions if written properly, right?
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Can the First Amendment exist without the Second? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and actually, like, think about this. I mean, the Second Amendment was sort of a kind of a dead letter for about 70 years before Heller, right? Like, in terms of the amount of regulation you can impose on gun laws in various states, I mean, it was dramatic. I think the Ninth Circuit basically made it illegal to own it, to conceal carry a handgun at one point. And Heller was ultimately the law that reversed that. But even in that time, like, you could still have the First Amendment. Really, it's, if you build, and this is ultimately, I guess, the value of having really kind of strong rule of law institutions, strong court system, strong traditions. Like, these things can work. It's hard, but they can work.
Will seems like the epitome of conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit. I don't think he is, and I coined that expression because I don't think Will's under any misconception that the progressives are the good guys.
Yeah, no, I'm not, and I don't want, there's some things where I'm like, okay, I don't want to go back to I think Jim Crow was bad, so I think it was probably good to get rid of that. But at the same time, like you say, like I'm trying to propose laws that would radically change the governance structure of the United States. Like, I'm for destroying public university systems, for making social media essentially much freer. These are like pretty radical, aggressive positions in order to solidify conservatives' ability to control government and culture. And so I think, the people who are like, if you're worried about the people who are like going to go on to get along, talk to David French and have him explain how it's wonderful that conservatives are being censored, and that's the Washington.
Because we're bringing the civility back to the discussion, or whatever nonsense he tells himself. Not numpstock. Boomstick is slang for firearm. Well, I'm from Brooklyn. Okay, cut me some slack. I use a machete. Yeah.
Right. I'm in Maryland now. I think I could get a long gun, but I can't get a handgun without a permit. And it's hard to get one here, I think.
I keep thinking America would function better as 50 nations with EU-style free travel. POTUS becomes a glorified mascot. That's nuts. You're getting closer. We need to have it 350 million nations, but I'll take what I can get. What do you think, Will?
I think the EU... I don't know. There's a big weakness that comes from that in terms of your ability to influence public affairs. I think the ultimate conclusion of that world would be a Chinese dominance over us. So, right, like there's power and strength. There's a reason the EU keeps trying to centralize more. And part of it is because they want more negotiating power. I think there's a real benefit to our system and the fact that we actually do have a strong, really powerful. We have a really strong, powerful sovereign. That's bad in some ways, but it's good in others.
Would this restriction impact shadow banning?
It could be written in such a way. I don't know, like that. It's trickier to write that law, and so that's one of those areas where you'd have to chase it down. But then I think about this, like other civil rights didn't all magically get fixed as a result of the '64 Act. Like there was the sort of chasing down, like people trying to find loopholes, people close the loopholes, people trying to find loopholes, people close the loopholes. I expect with things like shadow banning and algorithms, that's sort of like. That's where you might have a sort of like development of the law to ultimately stop some. But if you had a commitment from a conservative movement that says, no, the point is we want people to stop being censored, I think you could ultimately get there.
Well, let's talk about that right now. One of the reasons I'm not on Facebook and I'm on Locals, malice.locals.com is, and this has nothing to do with politics. When I was on Facebook, what I enjoyed was seeing all my friends' updates in reverse chronological order, right? No algorithm is going to map what my brain wants. If there's someone I haven't interacted with in 5 years, maybe now I just thought of them for some reason and I want to see it. And Facebook doesn't give me that option. It has an algorithm, and Instagram does the same thing. Wouldn't that be a very easy way for these organizations to, instead of Twitter, why Twitter, I like Twitter, why you like Twitter, I'm sure one of the reasons is that you see pretty much everything.
Yeah.
If this law is in place, wouldn't the next day be like, well, Twitter's too busy, so we're implementing an algorithm to improve quality conversation, and you know how that algorithm would be written.
Right. I mean, like you have to, I mean, that's a question of could they thwart it with algorithms, and could that not be something that we were able to track down the regulation? Maybe. Might not work. Still worth trying, and still worth seeing if we can't.
No, but what I'm saying is, wouldn't that in effect, instead of having it like they do now they're going to immediately be forced to do the algorithm.
Right. I mean, well, maybe, but again, it's like, that's not saying you're forced to follow everyone. Right. Like, I mean, Twitter, I think, could still operate with like 90% of its current functionality, or 90 more than that. Right. Blocking, muting, all that's people can block and mute and whatever, and users can select their own feeds.
No, but what I'm saying is, if I follow you, right, and now Twitter has an algorithm that shadow bans you because for whatever reason it's identified you, I can't see your site in my feed, your stuff in my feed.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe that should probably be unlawful somehow. I mean, I think it's a harder statute to write, but we should be trying to make that sort of thing unlawful.
So, okay. But at a certain point, then you're just basically having the government run the entire site.
A little bit. Yeah. Like, I think it's important enough to say that people have a right to speak on these massive social media platforms.
But here's what happens then. Here's my concern, right? So you have the government saying you can't shadow, and some of these things are not like kind of apolitical, right? Because social media, any websites innovate dynamically, right? So if you have the American government saying Twitter has to do this, and Instagram has to do this, and Facebook has to do this, doesn't that create a huge market opportunity for a company that's in some other country to have these innovations that maybe would be illegal under U.S. law, and basically ruin these American companies? I
mean, it's possible, but part of, I would say, if they did, good for them. I mean, if that's what people want more, great, right? Like, but let it happen. I'm not that invested in Facebook and Twitter like remaining the only platform. I would say it's probably unlikely because those places don't have 230, right? And so it's a lot harder for social media companies to get started there. I mean, I think actually this is one of the ways where the tech policy guys did persuade me that, like, hey, one of the reasons we ran the table on all these social media companies because we had 230 and like Europe and other places didn't.
Well, let me ask you this. So I'm not a lawyer, obviously, despite my background. So if I were Twitter and I filled out the form and now I'm headquartered in Chile or whatever, would these regulations still affect me, or how would that work?
They would. I mean, foreign companies that service American consumers have to abide by American law.
Okay. So that's not an easy workaround for them to kind of evade this at all. Okay. No. This isn't meant as a gotcha, but a genuinely question. How are these laws being enforced? They can't keep Pirate Bay off the net. Why is that? That's a great question.
I mean, the laws, if you create a private right of action, they're enforced the way any other tort law is, right? Like how does, what happens when you get sued and you have to pay a judgment and courts enforce the judgment, and there's a reason Twitter and Facebook pay their judgments when they're enforced in courts.
And I think another difference is Pirate Bay is not a public company. It's not trying to have respectability. You're never going to have, it's anonymous. You're never going to have senators and President Trump and all these people. It's by its nature illegal, pirate, and unlawful, intentionally so by every metric. So you're not going to have it have the same function as a Twitter or as a Facebook.
Right.
Should Google be made to have to share their own search algorithm or let you choose your own? Google search is the most pernicious shadow banning in this. Have you watched the documentary The Creepy Line?
No.
Okay, this is something, we're going to wrap up this because something extremely up your alley. There was a college professor, I forget his name, I had him on my show, and he testified in front of Congress and spoke to the president. And how it works is, let's suppose I'm Google, and I set it up so that the first 10 search results for Hillary Clinton is going to have articles talking about what a badass she is. And the first 10 search results for Donald Trump are going to be like, this is why Donald Trump shouldn't be president. From your perspective as the user, these are just the first 10 results. You're not going to have any awareness of what's going on in the back end. Here's another example. I'm Facebook. Let's suppose I have an innocuous ad. Hey, remember to vote today. If I put that ad only for people who had liked Hillary, and I don't run the ad for people who like Trump, that is going to have an enormously disproportionate effect. And it's something that no one would know. Because if I'm not seeing an ad being served, I would not have known that, or what's being run about. So this is a huge, huge issue. And I don't know if that we have, but this is what he's talking about. This is really the most pernicious kind of shadow banning.
Yeah, I mean, that strikes me as, if it's used for political discrimination, like, I am okay with imposing restrictions on Google, the big monopolies, right? The big five monopolies, I'm okay with imposing restrictions on them to stop discrimination, to stop political meddling. Now, can you catch it? Enforceability, that's hard. It's like, I'm not an expert, and so I don't know how to write the law right. But like, in the abstract, I would support constraints on the ability of these companies to do things like that.
Yeah, I'm surprised this hasn't crossed your desk, because this is, rather than ban, I'm not in favor of banning Laura Loomer or any of these other people, but this is something that's much more Orwellian and much more extremely dangerous than 100 people who we could probably name off the top of our heads, as opposed to this is systemic interference with voting and elections.
Yeah, I agree. It's something we got to fix. It's just, I don't know. I have my bailiwick so far, and it's been, although I think, I'm also senior counsel at the Internet Accountability Project, and so that we have some anti-Google stuff and privacy stuff that we do too. Okay,
last question, and then we got to bounce. If righties got kicked off Twitter, it would be as boring for lefties as Gab is for righties right now. Conflict is life. What made 4chan so fun? Right. I don't think 4chan had right and left, really. It was just everyone was an asshole.
Yeah, but I think that the point about Gab is accurate, and I think that's ultimately the problem. I mean, not only these companies that are trying to compete on the basis of being more free speech, it just they all have struggled really badly, and their incentives are counter to the rest of the conservative movement too, because they do better when conservatives are getting banned more, and I think there's a lot of weird problems with this particular type of social media competitor that make it kind of weird.
Okay, I want to thank Will for taking the time to have this very nice debate/discussion. People follow him on Twitter and check out Human Events. Where are you on the future of this country? White pilled or black pilled?
I am gray pilled. I don't know. I mean, I think it's who knows? I'm not permanently black pilled. I think we can take power back, and I think we could actually, implement some laws and really protect people's ability to speak. And once we do that, then we can start working in a lot of other ways.
You were the one what was that book you told me to read, which basically predicted everything that they're trying to do now?
Yeah, It's Time to Fight Dirty. Yeah.
It's Time to Fight Dirty. And basically that book lays out the radical, it's explicitly a guide to have systemic, permanent democratic control of Washington. And many of the things that are in that book it took 5 minutes to become the New York Times questions for all the presidential candidates at the time.
Yep. It wasn't hard to see coming.
So all of you, I would encourage to read that book, or the table of contents. Just all you need to know is his bullet points. So you can get, so they don't hide what they're trying to do. Be aware of what's happening. Thank you again to Will, and I will see you all soon. Have a good night, everybody. Okay.